The document hit the desk like a gunshot. Deputy Nelson Winslow stared at it, his jaw tight, his broad hands pressed flat against the scarred wood of his office table as though he needed the earth beneath him to stay solid. The parchment was crisp, official, bearing the unmistakable seal of a territorial land office, a red wax emblem pressed clean and deep, the eagle's wings spread wide. It was the kind of document that ended arguments before they started. The kind that sent men home empty-handed and swallowed their pride like bitter dust. Rancher Caldwell Briggs stood across from him, thumbs hooked in his suspenders, that slow smile spreading across his sun-cracked face like a stain. He had the look of a man who had already won, who had already rehearsed the victory speech and was only waiting for the world to catch up. "Well, Deputy," Briggs said, his voice carrying the lazy drawl of a man who had never once been told no, "I believe that settles it. The Harper land is mine, has been mine on paper for 6 months now. The deed is clear. The seal is the territorial mark, same as it always was. You want to stand in the way of a legal claim." Nelson did not answer immediately. He read the document again, carefully, the way a man reads something when his gut is screaming that something is wrong but his eyes cannot yet find the lie. The grant was made out to Caldwell Briggs. The date was 3 months before old Elias Harper had passed. The land, 160 acres of prime bottomland along the Vermilion Creek outside of Dusthaven, Colorado, had apparently been deeded over by Elias himself. The rival's claim looked airtight. Nelson had spent 12 years wearing a badge. He knew what valid looked like. He knew what the weight of lawful paper felt like in his hands, and this looked valid. His eyes moved to the corner of the room where Annie Harper sat very still on the wooden bench, her dark eyes reading everything, her hands folded in her lap over a small leather sewing case that never left her side. She was 26 years old and she had ridden 30 miles through blowing dust to contest this claim, and she had arrived at his office this morning looking like someone who had already calculated 3 moves ahead of everyone in the room. "It is not settled," she said quietly. She did not shout. She did not weep. Her voice carried the particular stillness of a person who is not afraid, which was, Nelson had already noticed, somehow more unnerving than fury. Briggs laughed. "Miss Harper, your father signed this deed. There is nothing to contest." "My father," Annie said, rising slowly from the bench, "could not write his own name in the last 2 years of his life. His hands shook too badly. He used a seal." She opened her leather sewing case and removed a small object wrapped in cloth, and Nelson felt the entire room shift. That was the moment. That was the crack in the stone. But he did not know it yet. Neither did Briggs. They would all learn it together, in the most stunning reversal Nelson Winslow had ever witnessed in his life. And it would cost him everything he thought he knew about himself, about the law, and about the infuriating, brilliant, achingly beautiful woman standing before him with a sewing needle and the truth. But to understand how they arrived at that charged and breathless moment in that dusty Colorado office in the autumn of 1883, you had to go back 6 days, to the afternoon Annie Harper first walked into Dusthaven with mud on her boots and fury behind her eyes. The town of Dusthaven sat at the base of the San Juan foothills like something God had left behind by accident. It was not a large town. It had a main street of packed earth, a general store, a telegraph office, a saloon called the Copper Spur, a church that leaned slightly to the left, and a jailhouse that doubled as the marshal's office. Marshal Ira Copeland was a decent man, but he was also 62 years old and had been wintering over a bad chest cold since September, which meant that the daily business of law in Dusthaven fell to his deputy. Nelson Winslow had been deputy marshal for 4 years. Before that he had ridden cattle up from Texas, worked 3 seasons as a ranch hand on the Gilcrest spread outside Pueblo, and done 1 year as a Pinkerton agent before deciding that chasing train robbers across the entire western half of the continent was not a sustainable profession. He was 31 years old, 6 feet 2 inches tall, with dark brown hair that needed cutting and gray eyes that had a way of making people feel examined. He was not particularly talkative. He was careful. He was thorough. And he had a reputation in the county for being the kind of lawman who read a situation the way a river man reads water, quiet on the surface, paying attention beneath. He was at his desk reviewing cattle theft reports when Annie Harper walked in. She came through the door without knocking, which immediately told him something. People who had been to law offices before knocked. People who were desperate and certain of their purpose did not bother. He looked up. His first impression was intelligent. Not pretty, though she was certainly that fine-boned and dark-haired, with a directness in her gaze that was almost masculine in its confidence. But what struck him first was the way her eyes moved around his office. She was cataloging it, taking stock of him the same way he had already taken stock of her. He felt himself appraised and filed away in the space of about 2 seconds, which was disconcerting. "You are the deputy?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am." "Good. I need to report an illegal land seizure." He gestured to the chair across his desk. She sat, placed her leather sewing case precisely on the corner of his desk, and began speaking. Her name was Annie Harper. Her father, Elias Harper, had died 7 weeks ago from a combination of age, rheumatism, and what the doctor in Pueblo had called a disease of the blood. He had lived on the homestead along Vermilion Creek for 22 years, since before Annie was born. The land was registered under his name in the Territorial Land Office in Denver. He had told Annie repeatedly that the land was hers when he passed. 3 days after the burial, Caldwell Briggs had ridden up to the homestead with 2 of his men and a document, and informed Annie that the land now belonged to him. Nelson asked her what kind of document. "A land deed," she said. "Purportedly signed by my father 6 months before he died, transferring the property to Briggs in exchange for the forgiveness of a debt my father supposedly owed him. The deed bears my father's seal." "Was there a debt?" "Not one I was ever told about. My father kept meticulous accounts. I have his ledger. There is no mention of Caldwell Briggs, no loan, no debt, no transaction of any kind." Nelson leaned back in his chair. This was not an unusual story in 1883. The frontier was full of men like Briggs, land-hungry, legally sophisticated enough to manufacture the appearance of legitimacy, counting on the isolation of homesteaders and the slowness of territorial bureaucracy to make their claims stick before anyone could contest them. The courts were far away. Judges were scarce. A good-looking deed with the right seal could hold up for months or years while the truth tried to catch up. "You left the property?" he asked. Her jaw tightened slightly. "Briggs had 2 men with rifles. I am not suicidal. Where are you staying?" "At the moment, nowhere. I rode here directly." He stood and went to the door. He called across the street to the woman who ran the boarding house, a heavy-set Norwegian widow named Mrs. Lund, and arranged a room for Annie Harper. Then he came back and sat down and looked at the woman across his desk. "I need to see the deed he presented," he said. "I know. I thought you might." She opened her leather case and produced a careful pencil sketch, not the deed itself, but a precise drawing of it, every line, every word, and most importantly, a detailed rendering of the wax seal. She had drawn it from memory, in high detail, before Briggs had taken the document away. Nelson stared at the sketch. She had a very particular talent, he would come to understand. Annie Harper had grown up learning her trade from her mother, who had been a seamstress and pattern maker of considerable skill. At the age of 12, Annie had begun assisting her mother. By the age of 16, when her mother died, she was running the small sewing operation herself, taking in garments from the farms and ranches within a day's ride, doing alterations and repairs and making clothes from scratch. She had an eye for fine detail that was almost supernatural. The ability to hold an image in her mind and reproduce it with exactitude, to notice the smallest variation in pattern or proportion, to read the story told by thread and seam and texture. She had drawn the seal with that same eye, and looking at her sketch now, Nelson felt the first small prick of unease. He had seen the territorial seal before. He knew what it looked like. Something in Annie's drawing was different, but he could not yet say what. He folded the sketch carefully and put it in his desk drawer. "I will ride out to the Briggs ranch tomorrow and request to examine the deed," he said. "He will not give it to you willingly. He does not have to give it to me willingly. He has to produce it if I ask under legal authority." He paused. "Miss Harper, I want to be honest with you. Without seeing the original deed, if the document appears legitimate, there is not much I can do at the local level. You may need to file a challenge with the Territorial Land Office in Denver." "I know," she said. "But by the time that challenge travels to Denver and back, Briggs will have had 6 months to establish himself on the property. He will have broken the ground and built structures, and it will be 10 times harder to dislodge him." She looked at him steadily. "I am not asking you to solve this alone. I am asking you to look carefully. Whatever this document is, it is not what it claims to be, and I think when you look closely you will see it." He met her gaze. There was no pleading in it, only certainty and a kind of quiet challenge. "I will look carefully," he said. She picked up her sewing case, stood, and nodded once. "That is all I ask." She left. Nelson sat for a long moment in the quiet of his office, and then he took the sketch back out of his drawer and looked at it again. He rode out to Caldwell Briggs's property the following morning. The Briggs spread sat 5 miles east of Dusthaven, a substantial ranch built up over 15 years of what everyone in the county described as aggressive ambition. Briggs had started with 200 acres and a handful of cattle and had expanded steadily, buying up land from failing homesteaders, absorbing smaller operations, occasionally through means that made people uneasy, but that no one had ever been able to directly name as illegal. He was the sort of man who existed in a perpetual gray zone, always just on the lawful side of his actions, always with the right paperwork, always with the right witnesses. He was also, Nelson had always thought, the sort of man who smelled very strongly of a person trying not to smell like what he was. Briggs received him on the front porch with the particular false warmth of a man who has been expecting this visit and has already prepared for it. "Deputy Winslow, what brings you all this way?" "I need to see the Harper land deed," Nelson said, not dismounting. He had found over the years that staying in the saddle during initial confrontations conveyed a useful kind of authority. "The document you presented to Annie Harper claiming the property on Vermilion Creek." Briggs's eyes narrowed by a fraction, then softened back into their calculated pleasantness. "Of course. Come inside." The deed was produced from a leather satchel with the careful speed of something that had been kept ready. Briggs laid it on his dining table and stood back with his arms crossed, the picture of a man with nothing to hide. Nelson read it slowly. The language was correct. The format was correct. The territorial stamp was in the right position. The date was plausible. Elias Harper's seal impression, a small stylized H within an oval, the private seal he used in place of a signature, was pressed clearly in red wax in the lower right corner. It looked valid. Nelson turned the document over. He examined the edges. He held it up to the light from the window. He felt the paper between his fingers. "May I borrow this document for 24 hours?" he asked. "I would like to compare it against the records at the land office." Briggs smiled. "That document does not leave this ranch, Deputy. I am sure you understand. A man's property rights are a serious matter. I would not want anything to happen to it, but you are welcome to look at it here as long as you need." Nelson looked at it a while longer, memorizing what he could. Then he thanked Briggs and rode back toward town. He was halfway back when he stopped his horse on the ridge above the creek and sat there in the thin autumn light, thinking about the seal. There had been something in Annie's sketch, some quality that nagged him. He pulled the sketch from his coat pocket and looked at it again in the outdoor light. The eagle's wings, the territorial seal that was stamped on the deed, he had seen it dozens of times on official documents. On Annie's sketch of the Briggs deed, the eagle's left wing had a slightly different arc than he remembered. He could not be certain. Memory was not a reliable instrument, but the feeling persisted. When he got back to Dusthaven, he went directly to the boarding house. Annie Harper was in the common room, bent over a piece of dark blue wool broadcloth laid across the dining table, a piece of tailor's chalk in her hand, making precise marks in long, confident strokes. 3 women from the town were standing nearby, watching with the interest of people who have never seen someone work with that kind of speed and authority. Mrs. Lund was among them, and she looked at Nelson with the expression of a woman who had just discovered a diamond in her garden. "She has already taken in 7 orders this morning," Mrs. Lund said, slightly awed. 7. "The Perkins girl wants a riding skirt, Mrs. Alcott needs a coat altered, and old Miss Harper," Nelson said. A moment. She set down her chalk and came to him without hurrying, wiping her hands on a cloth tucked into her waistband. He showed her the sketch. He told her what he had seen on the deed. Then he asked her the question that had been forming in his mind since the ridge. "Your father sealed the H in the oval. Did he have it made locally or did he bring it from somewhere?" She looked at him with sudden sharpened attention. "He had it made in Pueblo, about 15 years ago, by a seal maker named Hofstetter." She paused. "Why?" "Because the seal on that deed concerns me, but I cannot put my finger on precisely what is wrong with it." Annie was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I can." He looked at her. "My father's seal," she said carefully, "had a slight irregularity in the left interior of the oval. The tool that pressed the wax had a small nick in it, a crack in the metal, very fine, that left a hairline mark inside the oval border every time it was pressed. I noticed it when I was a child and I asked my father about it. He said it was just a flaw in the tool." She met Nelson's eyes. "Does the seal on the Briggs deed have that mark?" Nelson thought hard. He had looked at the seal for a good 2 minutes. He had not seen a hairline mark inside the oval border. But he had not been looking for one. "I need to see that document again," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "You do." It was not as simple as riding back out to the Briggs ranch and demanding another look. Nelson knew that if he pressed too openly, Briggs would understand he was being investigated, and would either make the document disappear or lawyer up and force everything into the slow machinery of the territorial courts, which would take months and achieve nothing while Annie sat without her land. He needed to think about this differently. He needed a reason to have both the Briggs deed and the original Harper homestead registration in the same room at the same time, in front of a credible witness, in a context that Briggs could not easily dismiss or delay. That evening, Nelson sat in the quiet of his office and wrote a letter to the Territorial Land Office in Denver, requesting any documents on file pertaining to the Harper homestead claim and the Elias Harper estate, citing an ongoing legal dispute under his jurisdiction. He sent it by telegraph the following morning, knowing it would take 3 to 4 days for a response. Then he had a more immediate idea. In the general store there was a notions section, small but serviceable, that stocked items for the sewing and domestic trade. He had walked past it 100 times without paying attention. Now he thought about wax seals and the tools that made them. He went to the general store and found exactly what he was looking for: a collection of standard wax seal stamps, sold for correspondence, most of them cheap brass implements with simple designs. None of them were the Territorial Eagle, but the store also sold a catalog from a Denver stationer, and in it Nelson found an entry for Territorial Land Office seals and the specifications for the official Eagle design used on Colorado documents since statehood in 1876. He bought the catalog and brought it to Annie. She sat at the table in Mrs. Lund's common room and went through the catalog page by page with the focused attention of a scholar. When she found the territorial seal specifications, she laid the catalog next to her original sketch of the Briggs deed seal and was quiet for a very long time. Then she picked up her sewing magnification glass, a small, powerful lens she used for needlework, and held it over both images. "The eagle on the official seal has 7 feathers visible on each wing in the standard press," she said quietly. "My sketch shows the seal on the Briggs deed has 8 feathers on the left wing." Nelson felt something cold move through him. "That could be a printing variation," he said, playing devil's advocate. Different press runs, different years. Yes, she said. It could be. She set down the glass and looked at him. But one feather too many, combined with a missing hairline flaw in the oval, combined with the fact that my father had no recorded debt to Caldwell Briggs, that is 3 things wrong, Nelson. 3 things that should not exist if this document is genuine. She had used his first name without appearing to notice. He noticed. We need the original, he said. Yes, she agreed again. We do. He sent another telegraph that day, this one to a colleague in Pueblo, a former Pinkerton associate named Harlan Marsh, who now worked private investigations in that city. Nelson outlined what he needed: any information on Caldwell Briggs, any history of property disputes, any known connections to document forgers, and most specifically, any record of a wax seal maker in the Pueblo area who could reproduce official-looking seals for private clients. While they waited for responses to travel back through the wire, Annie Harper settled into Dusthaven with the efficiency of a woman who had not spent a single day of her life being idle. She set up her sewing in Mrs. Lund's common room, and within 48 hours had established a clientele of 12. She was extraordinarily fast. Her fingers moved across fabric with a precision and speed that seemed to border on the mechanical, and yet the work she produced was delicate and beautiful, with small decorative details that her customers had not asked for and could not stop admiring. A running stitch of tiny leaves along the inside hem of a riding skirt, a perfectly symmetrical arrangement of bone buttons on a coat front. She had an aesthetic instinct that was unmistakably artistic, applied with the systematic efficiency of someone who never wasted emotion. Nelson found himself stopping by Mrs. Lund's more often than his actual business warranted. He told himself he was keeping her updated on the investigation, and he was, but he was also, though he would not have admitted it under questioning, watching her work. On the 3rd day he came in at mid-afternoon and found her ripping apart a finished seam, a long, careful seam she had spent an hour constructing the day before, according to Mrs. Lund. "What happened?" he asked, looking at the dismantled garment. "The grain was off by 2 degrees, she said without looking up, her attention fixed on the fabric. "I did not catch it until it was sewn. If I had left it, the skirt would have pulled to the left every time Mrs. Alcott walked. She would have spent the next 10 years thinking something was wrong with her gait." She looked up then, catching the expression on his face. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Only that 2 degrees seems invisible to most people," she finished. "Yes, that is the problem with invisible flaws. Most people cannot see them, so they assume they are not there. They are always there." She returned to her work. Nelson sat down in the chair by the window which he had come to occupy so regularly that Mrs. Lund had stopped offering it to other visitors. "That is an interesting way to think about forgery," he said. She paused. Her hands went still. "Yes," she said slowly. "I suppose it is." She set down her work and looked at him fully. "You think the same logic applies to the seal?" "I think that whoever made the seal on that deed was good at their job, good enough to fool most people, but they had a source document to work from, some official paper they had seen or obtained, and when they reproduced it, they introduced a variation. 1 feather too many. Maybe it was because their source document was a poor copy. Maybe it was an honest mistake." He leaned forward. "But the original would not have that variation. The original has exactly what the territorial spec says it has. And my father's personal seal," she said, "would have the hairline mark. And the Briggs deed does not." They looked at each other across the room. There was a specific kind of electricity in their silence that had been building for 3 days and that neither of them was yet prepared to name. "How do we get both seals in the same room?" she asked. He had been thinking about this. The response from Denver finally arrived the following day. A brief but useful telegraph from the Territorial Land Office confirming that the Elias Harper homestead registration was on file, and that the office had no record of any transfer, sale, or deed modification on the property prior to Elias Harper's death. The deed Briggs held was not on file with the territory. That was significant. It was not conclusive. A deed could theoretically have been executed privately without being filed with the territory, but it gave Nelson grounds to formally request an examination of the Briggs document under his authority as deputy marshal, with the backing of the Territorial Land Office's correspondence. He also received a telegraph from Harlan Marsh in Pueblo. What Marsh had found made Nelson sit very still at his desk for a full minute. 3 years ago, Caldwell Briggs had been involved in a property dispute in Fremont County that had ended with a competing claimant withdrawing under circumstances that the local court had found irregular but not prosecutable. The key witness in that case had been a document examiner from Denver who had testified that the challenged deed was genuine. That examiner had later been investigated by the territorial bar for questionable testimony in 2 other cases and had lost his license. And in that same Fremont County case, one of the witnesses to the disputed deed had been a man named Cyrus Fitch, who was, according to Marsh's investigation, currently employed as Caldwell Briggs's foreman. The foreman who had been standing at Briggs's side with a rifle when he arrived at Annie's homestead. The trap was old. The pattern was clear. Briggs had done this before. He had the infrastructure for it, the connections, the forged documents, the compliant witnesses. He was a professional predator who wore legal papers like armor. Nelson took all of this to Annie that evening. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, looking at the table. "He has been doing this for years," she said, "and nobody stopped him. Nobody could prove it completely enough," Nelson said, "and most of his targets did not have anyone to fight for them." She looked at him at that. There was something in her expression that was not quite gratitude. It was more complex than that, more guarded, but it was warm in a way that made him want to look away and also made him unable to. "I'm not the kind of woman who needs someone to fight for her," she said carefully. "I know," he said. "I did not say you were." A pause. "I am fighting beside you," he said. "There is a difference." She held his gaze for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and then she looked back at the table, and her hands found her needlework almost reflexively, the way a person reaches for something familiar when they are feeling unsteady. "So what do we do now?" she asked. "We need to get Briggs to produce the deed in a formal context, in this office, with the territorial correspondence in front of us with you present and with whatever items you need to conduct the comparison. He will bring a lawyer, probably. That is fine. I need him to bring the deed." Nelson composed a formal notice the next morning. He cited the discrepancy between the Briggs deed and the Territorial Land Office records, cited his authority as deputy marshal, and required Caldwell Briggs to present the disputed deed in the Dusthaven marshal's office within 48 hours for examination under legal authority. He sent it by rider to the Briggs ranch. Briggs arrived the following afternoon. He did not bring a lawyer, which surprised Nelson. What he brought instead was the easy confidence of a man who had reviewed his document and found it impervious, and the lazy contempt of a man who did not take a small-town deputy marshal seriously enough to engage legal counsel. He brought Cyrus Fitch as well, which was less surprising. Annie was already in the office when they arrived. She had her sewing case on the bench beside her. She sat very still. Nelson conducted himself with deliberate formality. He placed the Territorial Land Office correspondence on the desk. He cited the discrepancy in the filing record. He asked Briggs to produce the deed. Briggs produced it with the calm of a man who has never lost a hand of cards in his life. The deed lay on the desk. The red wax seal with the territorial eagle sat in its corner, bold and official-looking. The personal H&oval seal pressed cleanly below Elias Harper's name. Nelson read the document aloud formally into the record. Briggs smiled. "Well, Deputy," Briggs said, with that slow, spreading satisfaction, "I believe that settles it. The Harper land is mine." And Annie stood up from the bench. She walked to the desk without haste, opened her sewing case, and removed the cloth-wrapped object she had been carrying for 6 days. She unwrapped it carefully and set it on the desk. It was a small oval stamp, the H&oval seal that had belonged to her father. She had thought to bring it when she left the homestead, tucking it into her case in the frantic minutes before Briggs's men could turn her out, some instinct for evidence operating even in her distress. She had also, over the previous 2 days, while Nelson was sending messages and preparing the legal correspondence, quietly obtained something else. She had written to her aunt in Pueblo, her father's sister, and asked her to retrieve from the old family papers any documents bearing Annie Harper's seal. The aunt had sent back, by the fastest writer available, 3 letters her father had written years ago, each bearing his wax seal. Annie laid those 3 letters on the desk alongside the Briggs deed. She picked up her magnification glass, and in the absolute silence of that small Colorado office, with Nelson watching and Briggs watching and Cyrus Fitch watching and the dust motes hanging in the afternoon light, Annie Harper compared the seals. She did not rush. She moved the glass slowly over each impression, spending 30 seconds, 40 seconds, a full minute on each one. She worked from left to right along the 3 letters from her father, then moved to the seal on the Briggs deed. She looked up. "The 3 letters from my father," she said, in a voice so steady it was almost frightening. "Each show a hairline mark inside the left arc of the oval border. It is faint, but it is consistent across all 3 impressions. That mark is the result of a crack in the seal tool itself." She set the glass down. "The seal on this deed does not have that mark." Briggs opened his mouth. "Furthermore," she continued, and there was something in her voice now that shut Briggs's mouth again as effectively as a hand clamped over it, "the territorial eagle on this seal has 8 primary feathers visible on the left wing. The official specification for the Colorado Territorial Seal, as established at statehood and maintained in the office catalog, shows 7. She turned to Nelson. "The seal on this deed was not pressed by my father's tool, and the territorial mark on this deed is not from an official stamp. Both seals are counterfeit." The room held its breath. Nelson felt something move through him then that was equal parts professional cold fury and something else entirely. A feeling he had no name for in that moment, something that started in his chest and moved outward like heat from a fire, the overwhelming recognition of watching someone who was not just right but brilliantly, methodically, irrefutably right. She had seen the thing he had almost seen. She had known what to look for before he did. She had carried her father's seal and thought to write for the letters, and she had stood in this room without trembling and dismantled a man's carefully constructed 3-year fraud with a magnifying glass and the knowledge of her own craft. He had been a lawman for 12 years. He had never felt so thoroughly outpaced by another person's intelligence, and he had never respected anything more in his life. He turned to Briggs. Briggs's face had done something complicated. The easy smile was gone. In its place was the particular expression of a man watching a floor he thought was solid open up beneath him. "This is absurd," Briggs said. "These are legitimate." "Caldwell Briggs," Nelson said, and his voice had the flat authority of a man who has made his decision and will not be moved from it. "You are under arrest for the crime of document fraud, for the illegal presentation of a forged deed, and for the unlawful seizure of the Harper homestead property on Vermilion Creek." He moved fast. Briggs was still talking when the iron came out and the cuffs went on. Cyrus Fitch went for his gun and then thought better of it when he found himself looking at Nelson's Colt already leveled, because 12 years of law work gave a man quick hands regardless of what else was happening. Fitch was disarmed and secured. Briggs was put in the cell. Nelson sent a rider for the marshal and another to Denver with the full evidence package. It was over in less than 4 minutes. In the aftermath, when the noise had subsided and Fitch was locked in the second cell and Nelson had sent for Mrs. Lund to come witness the evidence documentation, he came back to the front room and found Annie sitting on the bench again, her sewing case in her lap, looking at her hands. She was shaking slightly. Not from fear, he thought. From the release of 6 days of sustained, iron-controlled tension. He sat down beside her, not across the desk, beside her, closer than professional distance. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. She laughed, a short, breathless sound. "I keep thinking about whether I should have brought it up sooner, the seal mark. I knew about it since I was a child and I never thought about it in the context of it is simply that I notice things, in fabric, in pattern. I never imagined." "You imagined exactly the right thing," he said. "At the right time." She looked at him sideways. Up close, she had not been this close to him before. She noticed that his gray eyes had flecks of darker gray in them, like river stone, and that the set of his jaw was softer than it usually appeared across a room. "You believed me," she said, "from the beginning. You did not. Most men would have told me there was nothing they could do and sent me to Denver. Most men would have been wrong," he said simply. She held his gaze and then looked away, and the shaking in her hand slowed and stopped. Marshal Copeland arrived that evening, coughing and irritable but alive and legally present, which was all that was required. He reviewed the evidence with the systematic thoroughness of a man who had been doing this since before Nelson was born, and he confirmed Nelson's arrest. The following morning, he sent the full case to the territorial court in Denver and dispatched word to the Fremont County authorities regarding the prior case. The deed was confiscated as evidence. Within the week, Annie was back on her land. It was not as simple as turning a key. There were legal processes, filings, confirmations, the machinery of territorial justice grinding through its necessary motions. But the homestead was secured against Briggs, who sat in Denver awaiting trial, and Annie Harper walked back through the door of her father's house with the particular expression of someone who has crossed back over a threshold they were not sure they would see again. Nelson rode with her. He had told himself he was going to ensure the property was properly vacated and that she was safely resettled before returning to Dusthaven. That was a professional duty. The 30-mile ride out along the Vermilion Creek through the brilliant cold gold of late October was purely professional. The creek ran low and clear along the edge of the property, the cottonwoods along its bank already half bare, their remaining leaves shaking loose in the canyon wind and drifting across the trail like slow yellow birds. The bottomland was extraordinary, rich flat soil, well watered, sheltered from the worst of the mountain wind by the folded hills to the north. Old Elias Harper had picked his ground well. Annie rode beside Nelson in silence for a long stretch, and it was the comfortable kind of silence rather than the uneasy kind, the kind that exists between people who have passed through something difficult together and no longer need to narrate every moment. "What will you do with the land?" he asked eventually. "What I was already planning before Briggs interrupted me," she said. "I am going to fence the bottomland and put in a kitchen garden come spring. I have a small flock of chickens coming from my aunt in Pueblo. She kept them for me while—" She stopped. "My father always wanted cattle, but he was too ill the last 3 years. I think perhaps 2 or 3 milk cows to start." She paused. "And I will keep sewing. There is more work here than I expected." Mrs. Lund asked if I would consider a permanent arrangement. "In Dusthaven, the town is closer to the property than I realized, an hour's ride or less if the spring road holds." He thought about this. "You would stay on the homestead but work in town." "Some days. Other times clients could come to me. I had already spoken with 3 women who would prefer I come to them." She glanced at him with something that might have been amusement and might have been something else. "You sound surprised." "I am trying to picture what your workday looks like." "Extremely full," she said, "and exactly how I prefer it." They reached the homestead in the early afternoon. Briggs's men had left it relatively intact. They had not been there long enough to do serious damage, and the house itself was undisturbed. The kitchen garden was overgrown but not destroyed. The chicken coop was empty. The small barn held only dust and old hay. Nelson went through the property while Annie moved through the house, and when he came back inside, he found her standing in the main room with her hand on the back of the rocking chair by the fireplace, her father's chair. He understood, her face very still and her eyes very bright. He stood in the doorway. He did not speak. He had enough sense for that. He simply stood there until she was ready. After a moment she took her hand from the chair and turned around, and she was composed again, her face clear, only the brightness of her eyes a remnant of the private grief that had passed through the room. "There is coffee in the pantry," she said, "if you would like to stay a while." "I would like that," he said. They sat at the kitchen table in the thin afternoon light and drank black coffee from mismatched cups, and they talked, not about Briggs, not about legal proceedings, but about ordinary things. She told him about her mother, who had been a Welsh immigrant, who had carried her sewing patterns across the ocean and then across the continent, and who had taught Annie that a woman's skill was the most permanent thing she could own, because it could not be taken from her by illness or misfortune or the death of a husband. He told her about Texas, about the cattle drives, about the particular loneliness of a man who is always moving, and the strange peace of finally stopping in one place long enough to know it. "Is that what Dusthaven is for you?" she asked. "A place you stopped long enough to know?" "Getting that way," he said. He rode back in the early evening, the sunset laying itself out across the San Juan foothills in extravagant pink and gold, and he thought about gray eyes and the feeling of a room settling around a person, as though it recognized them. The trial of Caldwell Briggs came before the territorial court in Denver in the spring of 1884. Nelson rode to Denver to testify. He gave his account carefully, methodically, laying out the sequence of investigation with the precision of a man who has spent his professional life constructing cases that hold up under pressure. But the testimony that broke the defense open was Annie's. She sat in the witness box in a dark green dress she had made herself beautifully cut, the collar and cuffs finished with a narrow dark braid that was, Nelson thought, the kind of detail a woman includes when she wants to be taken seriously and knows exactly how to signal it, and she explained the seals. She had brought both sets of documents. She had brought her magnification glass. She had brought the original seal stamp, and she had brought the 3 family letters. And she explained, with the calm, patient precision of a woman who has spent her entire adult life, explaining the logic of her craft to people who had not thought to look carefully before, the difference between a genuine impression and a forged one. She walked the court through each element, the hairline mark, the feather count, the variance in the oval arc, and she did it in language so clear and unfussy that the jury of 12 men who had never in their lives thought about wax seals understood it completely within 4 minutes. Caldwell Briggs was convicted of document fraud and criminal conspiracy. He received 5 years of hard labor. Cyrus Fitch, whose testimony against Briggs in exchange for a reduced sentence proved unexpectedly useful to the Fremont County investigation as well, received 2 years and forfeited his employment. The Harper homestead was confirmed legally and permanently as Annie Harper's property. When Nelson came out of the courthouse into the bright Denver spring and found Annie already on the steps, she was looking at the street with an expression he had not seen on her before, something released, like a tension she had been holding in her spine for months finally giving way. He stood beside her. "How does it feel?" he asked. "Like finishing a very long seam," she said. He laughed. It was a genuine laugh, the kind that came without his permission. She looked at him sideways and then she laughed too, and in the bright spring air on the courthouse steps in Denver, she looked younger than she had in 6 months, and he felt himself very powerfully and helplessly in something he should have probably noticed arriving long before now. They took the train back from Denver together, which was a convenience of shared timing and nothing else, obviously. They ate supper in the dining car. Annie had brought a small embroidery project and worked on it between courses with the same casual competence she brought to everything, a panel of extraordinary detail, a running vine of tiny blue flowers that Nelson found himself watching in the way you watch something beautiful without meaning to. "What is that for?" he asked. "Nothing specific yet," she said. "I make things when I am thinking. The pattern follows the thought." "What are you thinking about?" She looked at the embroidery for a moment. "The garden. Whether to put the kitchen plot on the east side of the house or the south, The south has more sun, but the east is more protected from the wind. South, he said. Sun is worth more than the wind protection in that particular valley. The hills take most of the north wind anyway. She looked at him. You paid attention to the property. I paid attention, he agreed. A longer pause. I have been thinking, she said, with the careful approach of a woman choosing her words precisely, that if I am going to manage the homestead and the sewing work in town, I will need to hire someone. The fencing is beyond what I can do alone, and I cannot be in two places at once. That is a practical problem, he said. Yes. She picked up her embroidery. The tiny flowers continued their confident progression across the cloth. It would help considerably to have a neighbor, someone whose property adjoined mine, who might be available for mutual arrangements. He was quiet for a moment. Is that a practical suggestion, he said carefully, or something else? She set down the embroidery and looked at him across the dinner table in the rattling, lamplit dining car, and the look on her face was direct and undefended in a way she rarely permitted herself, the way a person looks when they have finished calculating and made their decision. I am not a woman who speaks in riddles, she said. I told you that at the beginning. You told me a woman's skill is the most permanent thing she can own, he said. And that you were not asking me to fight for you. Both remain true. And also, he said, you are not asking me to fight for you now. No, she said. I am asking if you would like to be somewhere, specifically somewhere near me. The train rattled through the dark Colorado night. Somewhere ahead the mountains waited, and the creek, and the homestead in the bottomland with its overgrown kitchen garden and its empty barn and its rocking chair by the fireplace. I would very much like to be somewhere near you, Nelson Winslow said. Her smile, when it came, was not the practiced public expression she wore in town. It was smaller and more real, a private smile, arriving like something that had been stored for a while and was finally being allowed out. Then we should discuss, she said, picking up her embroidery again with the brisk air of a woman resuming her work, the matter of the south garden and possibly the fence line. He leaned back in his chair and watched the dark mountains go past the window, and felt something he had not felt in a very long time, which was the comfortable, expanding certainty of being exactly where he was supposed to be. The summer of 1884 moved over the Vermilion Creek Valley with a slow generosity, long days of mountain light, and evening breezes off the foothills that smelled of pine sap and dry grass. Annie's kitchen garden went in on the south side of the house. Nelson had been right about the sun, and by July it was producing more than she could use, which she addressed by taking the surplus to the Dusthaven market on Saturdays and selling it from a wagon alongside the small sewing commissions she kept up throughout the warmer months. Nelson had not bought land adjacent to hers. He had instead been honest with himself about what he actually wanted, which was not adjacent property but proximity of a different kind, and he had courted her with the patient thoroughness he brought to everything, not with flowers and speeches, because Annie Harper was not a woman who wanted speeches, but with presence, with helpfulness offered and never imposed, with conversation that assumed her intelligence and never talked around it. He was at the homestead most Sundays. Sometimes during the week, if the law work permitted. He helped her build the fence. She helped him, actually, correcting his post spacing twice with a measuring line she produced from her sewing case, which he found infuriating and correct in equal measure. He brought her books from the Dusthaven lending library, chosen after he had figured out that she preferred history and natural science to fiction, and she left him pieces of his broken buckle harness mended with stitching so tight, and even it looked machine-made. He met her aunt from Pueblo in August, when the older woman came to visit with the promised chickens, and he understood from the way the aunt watched him that he was being thoroughly evaluated, and that the evaluation was going reasonably well. One evening in late September, almost exactly a year from the day Annie had first walked into his office, they were sitting on the front step of the homestead after supper watching the last color leave the sky over the San Juan peaks. It was a clear evening, cold enough for a coat but not bitter, and the creak was audible from where they sat, low and quiet after the dry late summer. Nelson had been thinking for 2 months about what he wanted to say and how he wanted to say it, and he had discarded about 14 versions on the grounds that they were either too small for what he meant or too large and formal for who they actually were to each other. What he settled on in the end was the truth stated plainly. "Annie," he said. She turned. She was wearing the dark green coat she had made herself, and in the last of the evening light, her face was very clear and very still in that way she had when she was paying complete attention. "I have thought about what I am and what you are," he said, "and I have come to the conclusion that I would very much like the rest of my life to involve this." He gestured, somewhat awkwardly, at the fading sky, the creek, the house, and lastly at her. "At whatever level you find suitable, up to and including the most permanent arrangement possible." She looked at him for a long moment. The creek murmured. Somewhere in the foothills an owl began its evening call. "You are asking me to marry you," she said. "I am asking if you would consider it." Another pause, shorter this time. "I will not give up the sewing work," she said, "or the market, or my independence in managing this property." "I would not ask you to," he said. "It would be like asking you to stop breathing." Something in her eyes shifted, softened. "And the land," she said, "this land stays in my name. Obviously, it was your father's, it is yours." She looked at the homestead for a moment, and he saw her thinking about everything it represented, the 22 years of her father's work, the fraud that had tried to take it, the battle she had fought to hold it, the permanence of that. "Yes," she said. He turned to look at her. "Yes, you'll consider it, or—" "Yes, I will marry you, Nelson," she said, with the faint, dry patience of a woman explaining something to someone who has been slower on the uptake than usual. "That is what yes means." He laughed. She laughed. And then he took her hand, which was warm and competent and very specific in its character, exactly like the woman it belonged to, and she let him hold it while the last light went out over the mountains. They were married in December 1884, in the Leaning Church in Dusthaven, with Mrs. Lund weeping happily in the front pew and Marshal Copeland standing up for Nelson, with the gruff approval of a man who had watched this coming for 14 months. Annie's aunt came from Pueblo and cried in a more dignified way than Mrs. Lund, but no less thoroughly. The church was decorated with cloth flowers Annie had made from scraps, impossibly detailed, pinned to the window frames in white and gold. Annie wore a dress she had made for herself over the preceding 2 months, in ivory wool broadcloth with a fitted bodice, and a long line that was simple and clean and absolutely perfect in every seam. She had embroidered the cuffs and collar with the same tiny blue flowers from the embroidery she had been working on the train to Denver. Nelson, seeing her come through the church door, forgot the entirety of the speech he had prepared. He told her this afterward. "I noticed," she said, not unkindly. "What did I actually say?" "I do," she said, "twice," which was sufficient. The first year of their marriage had the particular quality of two self-sufficient people learning how to share space without losing themselves in it, which was occasionally complicated and consistently interesting. Annie continued her sewing work with the energy and focus she had always applied to it, expanding as the months passed into a small established reputation that extended beyond Dusthaven into the wider county. She took commissions for wedding gowns, for formal garments, for the kind of precise tailoring that the nearest town of any size was still 2 days' ride away. She employed, by the spring of 1885, a young woman named Clara Draper who had come to her asking to apprentice, and whom Annie taught with the same patience and exactitude her mother had brought to teaching her. Nelson had resigned his deputy position when they married, not because of any pressure from Annie, who had never suggested such a thing, but because 12 years of law work was a long time, and the Vermilion Creek homestead had, it turned out, considerably more work to it than Nelson had initially assessed from the outside. He put the fence up properly. He built a second barn. He brought in 3 milk cows and, by the second year, a small beef herd. He discovered that he had a genuine aptitude for the practical management of land that had been lying dormant under 12 years of badges and paperwork, and that the satisfaction of working ground you actually owned was different from and considerably deeper than any satisfaction he had found in any other occupation. He also, occasionally, consulted for Marshal Copeland on matters requiring investigation, which suited everyone. It got Nelson out of the house on specific occasions and gave Copeland the benefit of the most skilled investigative mind in the county without the complication of a salary. In the late summer of 1885, Annie told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen at breakfast, in the same direct matter-of-fact way she told him everything, which was that she folded the newspaper she had been reading, looked at him across the table and said, "I believe we will need to prepare a third bedroom." He stared at her. "The spring will be busy," she continued, already reopening the newspaper, "so we should arrange the building work now while the weather holds." He got up from his chair and came around the table and took the newspaper very gently out of her hands and set it down, and he held her face in his hands for a moment and looked at her with the full weight of everything he felt, which was very large and not particularly articulable, and she looked back at him with those clear dark eyes that saw everything and understood it faster than most people thought to look for it. "A third bedroom," he said. "Yes," she said. "All right," he said. He built it himself, with help from 2 of the neighboring ranch hands, through September and October. He built it well with a window facing east toward the hills, because Annie's workroom faced south and he thought the child, whoever they turned out to be, should have their own light. The boy was born in April 1886, in the room with the east window, with the help of the Dusthaven midwife and Annie's aunt, who had come up from Pueblo for the event and stayed 3 weeks. They named him Elias for Annie's father, and he was a large, loud, emphatic baby who expressed his opinions clearly from the first hour of his life, which Nelson said suggested he had inherited Annie's directness, and Annie said suggested he had inherited Nelson's stubbornness, and they were probably both right. Elias Harper Winslow grew up in the bottomland along the creek, the child of 2 people who had fought for the ground beneath their feet and knew its value precisely. He learned to ride by the age of 4 on a small pony Nelson bought from a neighboring ranch, and which Annie inspected for soundness, before the purchase was made with the same methodical eye she brought to bolts of fabric. He spent his first years following his mother through the workroom, watching her hands move across cloth, and then following his father through the barns and fields, watching him read the ground and the animals and the weather with the accumulated knowledge of years. Annie had a daughter in 1888, a fierce, dark-haired girl named Margaret, after Annie's mother. Margaret came into the world with the same emphatic clarity as her brother, and immediately established that she was not going to be overlooked, which her parents found entirely predictable and not at all surprising. The sewing work grew. By 1890, Annie had outgrown the workroom she had set up in the house, and Nelson built her a proper studio, a separate building behind the house with 2 large south windows for the best light, space for 2 work tables, and a wall of shelves for her bolts of fabric, her pattern books, her growing library of design references. She had 4 apprentices by then, and a reputation that had spread as far as Denver and Pueblo, and twice she had been commissioned for garments that traveled by rail to customers she had never met in cities she had never visited. She never lost the leather sewing case. It sat on the corner of her primary work table, and in it she still kept her best needles, her finest thread, her magnification glass, and her chalk. She had replaced the chalk 3 times and the needles twice, but the case itself was the original worn now, the leather soft as cloth from years of handling, the brass clasp green at the edges. It had been with her when she rode into Dusthaven. It had been with her in the office when Briggs laid the forged deed on the desk. It had been with her in the Denver courtroom. Nelson had said once, early in their marriage, that the case was her weapon. She had considered this and said that she preferred to think of it as her credential. Both were true. In 1891, Marshall Copeland died peacefully in his own bed, which he had always said was the only respectable way for an old lawman to go, and the town of Dusthaven asked Nelson to take the marshal's position. He was 40 years old, experienced, known, respected, and utterly unglamorous about it in the way that genuinely effective law officers tend to be. He accepted on the condition that the position did not require him to give up the ranch, which the town agreed to because they were not in a position to negotiate. He wore the marshal's star with the same lack of ceremony he brought to everything. Annie sewed him a new coat for the position, dark wool, well cut, with a hidden interior pocket she added without explaining, which turned out to be exactly the right size for the folded papers and correspondence he habitually carried. He had not asked for it. She had simply measured him and constructed the coat with the knowledge of exactly who he was and how he functioned, and he put it on and felt, as he usually did when wearing something she had made, the specific sensation of being understood. They had one more child, a boy named James, born in 1893, calm where his siblings were emphatic, observant where they were active, already at the age of 3 showing signs of having his mother's capacity for sustained, focused attention, combined with his father's patience, which his parents regarded as either a formidable combination or an extremely dangerous one. The homestead along Vermilion Creek grew into a working ranch of modest size and complete self-sufficiency. The bottomland was rich and well managed. The kitchen garden had been expanded twice, and now supplied not only the family but a portion of the Dusthaven market on a seasonal basis. The fences were straight and properly spaced, Annie had checked, and the barns were solid. The east-facing bedroom had been occupied by Elias, then by Margaret, then by James, and the walls of it had been marked with their heights year by year in pencil, a layered record of growth on the wood Nelson had cut and fitted himself. On an evening in October of 1893, not long after James's birth, Nelson and Annie sat on the front step of the homestead again. The same step, the same direction, the same mountains in the last of the day's light, and there was in the quality of the silence between them the particular texture of two people who have built something together over years and can sit inside it without needing to speak about it. But Nelson spoke, because there was something he had wanted to say for a long time. "I have been thinking," he said, "about the moment in the office with the seal." She looked at him. "I was certain," he said. "I had looked at that deed twice and I thought it held. I thought Briggs had you. And then you stood up and you were so completely unafraid and you took out that magnifying glass and you just—" He stopped. He looked at the mountains. "I have never been so thoroughly outrun by anyone in my life, and I have never been happier to lose a race." She was quiet for a moment. "You did not lose a race," she said. "I was 3 days behind you. You believed me," she said, "before you had any evidence. You sat across that desk on the first day and you looked at my sketch and you felt something was wrong and you believed me enough to pursue it. That is not losing anything." She paused. "That is the thing I remember most, you know. Most people would have sent me to Denver with polite condolences. You believed that there was a thing to find." He looked at her. "And you found it," he said. "We found it," she said. "The creek ran in the early autumn dark. The chickens were already quiet in the coop. Somewhere in the house behind them, 3 children were in various stages of sleeping, and the sound of the house, its particular creak and settle, the wind at the east window, the familiar voice of an old structure that had absorbed a decade of family life into its timber, was the most complete sound Nelson Winslow had ever heard. He took her hand. She let him. Her fingers were still the fingers of a seamstress, strong and precise, and faintly calloused at the tips in the specific places where a needlewoman builds her working durability, and he knew them now as well as he knew any ground on this ranch, by feel and pressure and the particular warmth of them. "Annie," he said. She said, looking at the mountains. "I love you." She turned to look at him, and the smile that came was the private one, the real one, the one she had never shown anyone in a courtroom or a general store or a sewing studio. It was a quiet smile, precisely and completely honest, no performance and no reservation. "I know," she said. "I know you know," he said. "I am saying it anyway." "Yes," she said. "I love you too, Nelson. I have for a long time." The mountains held their ancient still positions against the sky. The creek negotiated its way over its old familiar stones. The house behind them breathed in the evening wind. And on the front step of the homestead on Vermilion Creek, on the ground that had been fought for and won and worked and built upon, Marshal Nelson Winslow sat with his wife and felt the extraordinary ordinary completeness of a life that was exactly where it was supposed to be. By 1895, Elias was 9 and already the most competent rider of his age in the county. He had his mother's dark eyes and his father's jaw, and a particular combination of the two of them that expressed itself as a child, who was simultaneously stubborn and meticulous, which his teacher in Dusthaven described as challenging, and his parents recognized as entirely their fault. He had been helping Nelson with the cattle work since he was 6, and helping Annie in the sewing studio since he was 5, and he showed no sign of committing to either path yet, which both his parents privately thought was the appropriate approach. Margaret, at 7, was learning to sew. She was extraordinarily good at it, which surprised no one. She had her mother's eye and her grandmother Margaret's Welsh stubbornness, applied to everything from her embroidery to her arithmetic with equal intensity. She had also recently developed a deep interest in the horses, following Nelson through the morning feeds with a proprietary confidence that the horses themselves seemed to find acceptable. James, the youngest, was at 2 the quietest of the 3, a large-eyed solemn baby who had grown into a large-eyed solemn toddler, who watched everything with the specific focused attention of someone taking very careful notes. Annie said he reminded her of the way she felt when she was measuring a complex pattern. Nelson said he reminded him of the early stages of an investigation. They meant the same thing. The studio behind the house had become, by 1895, a genuine center of work and community. Annie's apprentices came and went. Clara Draper had married a cattleman and moved to Pueblo but wrote regularly with updates and questions about difficult seams. 2 other young women from the county came to learn from Annie now, and she taught them with the same patience and exactitude her mother had brought to her own teaching, with the same underlying philosophy. A woman's skill is the most permanent thing she can own. Not because it was the only thing that mattered, but because it was the thing that could not be taken. She also taught Margaret. On Saturday mornings, when the week's work was finished and the household was quiet, Margaret would sit beside her mother at the work table with a small piece of fabric and a threaded needle, and Annie would show her carefully, at the pace of a child's hands, how to read the grain of cloth, how to follow the geometry of a seam, how to construct something that would hold against time and wear and the hard practical life of the frontier. Margaret had, one Saturday in September, pressed her thumb hard against a pin and stuck herself, and had sat very still for a moment with the kind of silent determination of a child who will not cry in front of a parent she is trying to impress. Annie had not made a fuss. She had taken the small thumb, pressed it briefly in a cloth, examined it, and returned it to its owner. "Needlework requires blood occasionally," she said. Margaret had looked at her with her mother's own direct gaze. "Does it stop hurting?" "Yes," Annie said, "and then it happens again." Margaret thought about this. "That does not sound encouraging." "No skill worth having comes without cost," Annie said. "The cost is what makes you value it." Margaret considered this seriously, in the way she considered most things, and then picked up her needle again. Nelson, passing the studio window and seeing this, had stopped walking and stood there for a moment in the September light, watching the two of them bent over the work table, his wife and his daughter, the teacher and the student, the continuance of something that had begun before his knowing them and would go on after him. And he felt in his chest the particular fullness of a man who has been, against all reasonable expectation, given more than he deserved. He walked on without interrupting them. The years moved as years do in country where the seasons are distinct, and the land makes its claims clearly with a rhythm of work and rest, of difficulty and abundance, of small daily satisfactions and occasional larger ones. The ranch grew steadier. The sewing studio maintained its reputation and its clients. Dusthaven grew slightly, as small frontier towns sometimes do in the closing decade of the 19th century, acquiring a second general store and an actual doctor, and a school that grew to 2 rooms. Nelson continued as marshal, dealing with the mostly minor crimes of a mostly working community, a theft here, a fight there, the occasional larger matter that required careful handling. He was good at the work and known to be, and he continued to be good at it with the same undemonstrative competence he had always brought to it. He was not, he thought, a dramatic man. He did not like drama. He preferred accuracy. Annie continued to be, as she had always been, the most accurate person he had ever known. In the summer of 1897, Caldwell Briggs was released from prison. He had served his full sentence and had, by all accounts, emerged from it a considerably reduced version of himself, older, smaller in his person, the easy confidence of a habitual predator having apparently been worked out of him by 5 years of hard labor. He did not return to the Dusthaven area. He was reported to have gone east, to relatives in Missouri, and to have given up entirely any further connection to the Colorado Territory. Nelson heard about it through a colleague in Denver and mentioned it to Annie that evening at supper. She took this in, ate a thoughtful bite of bread, and said, "Good." And that was all she ever said about Caldwell Briggs. Elias turned 12 in 1898 and declared his intention to study law. He had arrived at this intention through a path that made complete sense to his parents. He had spent years watching his father conduct legal proceedings, and his mother analyze evidence with the particular skill of someone who understood the logic of constructed things, and he had concluded that law was the intersection of both. Nelson thought this was an excellent idea, and immediately began identifying the best ways to prepare a frontier child for a proper legal education, which was a practical problem he threw himself into with characteristic thoroughness. Annie said nothing immediately, and then that evening when Nelson came to bed, she said quietly that she thought they would need to start saving specifically for the purpose, which they did. Margaret, at 10, remained entirely committed to both horses and sewing and showed no sign of choosing between them, which her parents had stopped trying to encourage her to resolve. She would figure it out. She always did. James, at 5, had begun following Annie around the studio with the large-eyed attention he brought to everything, and had recently started asking questions about the patterns, not about how to sew them, but about how they were designed, how the shapes related to each other, how the flat pieces became a 3-dimensional garment. He had a mathematical instinct for it that Annie found extraordinary, and that she carefully, patiently fed with explanations that assumed his capacity to understand and were, consistently, rewarded by the evidence that he did. It was James who, on a warm afternoon in June of 1899, picked up the leather sewing case from the corner of his mother's work table and examined it with the meditative attention he gave to everything, turning it over in his small hands. "Where did this come from?" he asked. Annie looked up from her work. "I have had it since I was younger than you are. My mother gave it to me." "What is inside it?" She came to him and sat beside him on the bench and opened the case. She showed him the needles, the thread, the chalk. She showed him the magnification glass. She told him in the way she told all her children things with complete honesty at the level they could receive it, about the morning she had ridden into Dusthaven, about the deed, about the seals. James listened without interrupting, turning the magnification glass in his fingers. "So you saw the difference," he said, "when nobody else did." "I knew what I was looking for," she said. "That is the important thing. If you know what you are looking for, you can find it." He considered this. "And that is why your father's land stayed your land." "Yes," she said, And why I was able to stay here." He looked up at her. "And why you met Papa," she smiled, the private smile, the real one. "Yes," she said, "and why I met your father." James turned the magnifying glass toward the window and watched the light catch in it and break apart into small, bright fragments across the wall of the studio. "I want to learn the patterns," he said. "I know," she said. "I will teach you." On the last Sunday of October 1899, Nelson and Annie were on the front step again, an old habit, years deep now, the evening ritual of two people who had earned their rest and taken it in the same place for 15 years. The mountains were the same mountains. The creek was the same creek. The house behind them had added a room and a proper covered porch and a second chimney, but its essential character was unchanged. A house that had been Elia's Harper's and was now the Winslow family's, worn smooth by decades of hands and seasons. Elia's was inside with his school books. Margaret was in the barn with the horses, where she was always to be found at this hour, and from which she would emerge shortly smelling of hay and entirely unrepentant about it. James was asleep, as small children are at this hour, in the east-facing room. The autumn light was the same particular gold it had been in the beginning. Nelson thought about this, about beginnings, and about how you cannot identify them when they are happening, only afterward when you can see the line from there to here. A woman walking into his office without knocking, a sketch of a seal made from an extraordinary memory, a document laid on a desk, and the calm, devastating intelligence of a woman who had looked at it and seen exactly what it was. He had been a deputy who thought the rival's claim was valid, and then the seamstress had compared the seals. "Annie," he said. She looked at him. "I keep thinking," he said, "that there was a version of that day where I just accepted the document, where I read the deed and said there was nothing I could do and sent you to Denver." "I know," she said. "That version," he said, "is a very bleak alternative." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the mountains. The creek said its same small, repeated thing in the dark below the cottonwoods. "I would have found another way," she said, and she meant it. He knew her well enough to know that she meant it absolutely. She would have fought it through the courts, through Denver, through every legal mechanism available to her, because she was the kind of person who found a way. She did not require rescue. "I know you would have," he said. "But," she said, and there was something in the single word that was softer than most of her speech, "I am glad I did not have to." "So am I," he said. She leaned her head briefly against his shoulder, a gesture she rarely made, private and specific to these evening moments, and he felt the familiar particular weight of her, the realness of it, 15 years of realness and continuity, and the specific irreplaceable texture of a person who has been the solid fact of your life for a long time. "We should go in," she said eventually. "Margaret will need to be called from the barn." "She will come when she is ready," he said. "She will come when she is called," Annie said, standing and straightening her coat with the brisk efficiency of a woman resuming her affairs. "There is a difference." He stood beside her. The mountains held their evening positions. The creek ran its patient course through the bottomland that was Annie Harper Winslow's, had always been hers, was testified to by two seals, one genuine, one false, and by the quiet steadiness of a woman who had carried a magnifying glass into a lawman's office and changed the direction of both their lives with the knowledge of her hands and the accuracy of her eyes. Nelson Winslow put his arm around his wife's shoulders as they turned back toward the house, and the door opened warm and golden before them, and inside the house that had been built and defended and filled across the years, their children waited in the ordinary, irreplaceable fact of being exactly where they were supposed to be. The front step was empty in the rising moonlight. The mountains were still there. The creek ran on.